Hi there. Welcome, everyone. I am Patricia Cumby, pronouns she, her, and I'm the Communications Manager for Global Rights for Women. Today, we'd like to welcome you to this conversation we're very excited about, Beyond Toxic Masculinity, Challenging Patriarchal Socialization. I will start with a land acknowledgement, and our moderator, Chuck Derry, will begin the session. Global Rights for Women gratefully acknowledges the Indigenous people of the lands we are on today. Even though we are meeting in a virtual space, it is important for us to recognize that we have benefited and continue to benefit from the theft and occupation of this land since before the United States was formed as a nation. Global Rights for Women is located in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and acknowledges we are on Dakota and Anishinaabe lands. We recognize the discrimination and violence inflicted upon Indigenous people around the world. Additionally, we understand the treatment of Indigenous women is a byproduct of colonialism, racism, and misogyny that has perpetuated the continued sexual abuse, disappearance, and murder of Indigenous women. Please join us in a moment of reflection to acknowledge the harm of the past and present, and to consider how you can help dismantle continued oppression of Indigenous communities and restore justice. Since people are joining us from around the world, at this time, if you'd like to put into the chat the land that you are acknowledging, we'd appreciate it.
Thank you, Patricia. That's such a critical first comment and statement for this event. So often Indigenous people are invisible throughout the world. So thank you very much for doing that. That's great. And thank you to all of you for coming to Global Rights for Women's conversation series, Valiant Voices. I'm Chuck Derry and will be today's moderator. I'm the founder and director of Gender Violence Institute in Clearwater, Minnesota, USA. And it's an organization that is a resource and development firm to end gender-based violence. Valiant Voices is a conversation series, Global Rights for Women, created that features human rights advocates and survivors who are addressing injustice and disrupting oppressive systems that cause harm. These are stories of leaders creating change in their communities and around the world. We are pleased to share that Valiant Voices was the 2023 recipient of the National Purple Ribbon Award for Outstanding Domestic Violence Podcast. This recognition for excellence would not be possible without our generous donors who support these conversations and the guests who bring their authentic selves, sharing their experiences, expertise, and passionate commitment for ending gender-based violence around the world. We are also grateful Valiant Voices has been funded in part by the Global Awareness Fund of the Duluth Superior Area Community Foundation. It's in northern Minnesota. We welcome your comments, as Patricia had mentioned, in the chat or questions in the Q&A section on Zoom. And after the conversation, we'll send out a link with the recording. If you need a certificate of attendance, please contact us at globalrightsforwomen@grwomen.org. Today, we'll be talking about gender-based violence. We recognize that there are survivors here, and parts of this conversation may be triggering. So we are including resources for people in the US and internationally in the chat for those who need safety and assistance. So please take good, gentle care of yourself during and after this conversation. So first thing we want to do is introduce the guests. So I'm pleased to introduce each of the panelists. Graham Barnes is a program developer and men's group facilitator with Pathways to Family Peace, and he is based in Auckland, New Zealand. He was a founding men's program coordinator at Hamilton Abuse Intervention Pilot Project, then trained on this in the Aotearoa, New Zealand, and Australia. In Duluth, Minnesota, between 1995 and 2005, Graham worked with domestic abuse intervention programs on the development of a safety and accountability audit and related tools and training resources for a multi-agency response. In Minneapolis, Minnesota, Graham worked as a training and technical assistance specialist with the Battered Women's Justice Project. In Auckland, Graham piloted SHINE's employer response to domestic violence. Graham trains teachers in Aotearoa, New Zealand, on structures and curriculum to better serve Maori students in mainstream schools. He also continues to co-facilitate online men's nonviolence groups programs. Thanks for joining us, Graham. Great to have you here.
Thanks.
Hugh Lester Douglas, in addition to his past work as Deputy Director of Men Stopping Violence, Hugh Lester Douglas is a psychotherapist with extensive training and experience working with individuals, families, and communities impacted by violence. He obtained his undergraduate and graduate degrees from the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, and was an adjunct professor at Emory University. Hugh Lester has provided consultation, training, and keynote presentations in 40 states, Europe, and the Caribbean to community-based organizations, universities, corporations, and government agencies. Hugh Lester was honored by Lifetime Television for Women and the National Network to End Domestic Violence in 2003, the Ford Motor Company in 2012, and the City of Atlanta in 2017 for his work to prevent violence against women. He has also received numerous awards, including a National Institute of Mental Health Fellowship in 1990, the National District Attorneys Association Stephen L. Van Ryzen Lecture of Merit Award in 2010, and the National Black History Task Force Comrade Salute Award in 2004. In 2015, Hugh Lester was appointed as a commissioner by Governor Deal to the Georgia Commission on Family Violence. He has been interviewed by local, national media, and has authored and co-authored articles and curricula on family violence and other human rights issues. Thank you, Lester, for being with us. It's excellent. Thank you. Peter Mukuka brings over 8 years of committed experience in community development to his professional pursuits. With expertise spanning project management, computing and information systems, leadership, and training facilitation, he is driven by passion for driving impactful initiatives. Peter's skills extend to grassroots organization, capacity building, youth engagement, and community mobilization. As a founder and CEO of Men of Honor, a youth-led nonprofit organization dedicated to empowering young people as catalysts of positive change, Peter focuses on nurturing, mentoring, and coaching adolescent boys and men to become conscientious change agents tackling diverse community challenges. He is deeply dedicated to unlocking the transformative potential within young people through encouraging male involvement. Thank you, Peter. Thank you for all of you for joining us. It's great. So I'm going to give you just a little background information, what we're going to talk about today. And I want to start with the statistics about gender-based violence. So the Center for Disease Control in the United States says that in the US, 1 in 2 women will experience sexual assault at least once in their lifetime. 1 in 2. That's half the women in the United States will be sexually assaulted, predominantly, of course, by men. There's so many other reports that indicate 1 in 3 women will experience domestic violence. Again, this is 1 in 2 women sexually assaulted, 1 in 3 being domestically assaulted. That's 1 in 3 women we know, 1 in 3 women we work with, 1 in 2 women are in our families, in our faith communities, that we walk down the street, 1 in 2, 1 in 3. Now, there's no way that this many men could be beating and raping this many women without widespread cultural support. It couldn't happen at this rate. And this is just not US rates. These are global. Some are a little different country by country, but they're all extremely high, just like these US rates are. Extremely high men's violence against women. So today's conversation will be about what individuals and systems can do to challenge patriarchy for the goal of ending gender-based violence. Patriarchy is a system of male dominance with the abuse of women deeply woven into all cultures. Societies and institutions need to address patriarchy as a system that benefits men as a group, going beyond dealing with problem individuals or quote unquote toxic behavior. Not every man experiences power and privilege the same way, yet legal and social policies reinforce and perpetuate social attitudes that able-bodied cisgender men are superior. With the expectation that women, gender expansive people, and the most marginalized are to relinquish power over their lives and conform in public and private spaces. Today, we'll talk with men engaged in dismantling patriarchy and challenging the gender binary. We will discuss how they've interrogated the beliefs they learned as children and how it has informed their current professional work seeking to end injustice. So I'm going to ask the panelists some questions. And first, I'm going to start with an open question. And that is, I know that everyone here comes to this conversation with unique personal and professional histories and messages you got as boys about girls. So I'd like to start by asking briefly, how and why did you get engaged in the field of working with men on transformational behavior changes? And as you have progressed on your journeys, how have you held yourself accountable to challenging patriarchy? So anyone want to start? You go right ahead.
Right. Thank you so much. I think I'll go first with this question. First of all, I just want to say thank you so much to Global Rights for Women for organizing this event and also for having me on this platform. And also just to recognize my fellow panelists for this session. Yeah, so I think for me, it's in two parts, or rather two reasons. First of all, I think it's personal. It's coming from my own experiences growing up as a boy child, and also just maturing into an adult male. I experienced a lot of like various messages around gender and gender roles that perpetuated abuse. And I experienced that, first of all, within my home, but also within the extended family and the larger communities where women and children were being abused physically and in many other ways by the men. So where I'm coming from, I didn't really see any male individuals or people that could, inspire me to be a man. And I was asking a lot of questions around that. Then, as I got into my professional space, and that's the second reason, I've been working with communities on the programs, on different projects in the communities that were focusing more on women, girls, as well as youth programs. And those programs were dealing with issues, for example, like gender-based violence, teenage pregnancies, child marriages, and other social issues. But then I realized that, boys and men were not really being brought to the table to discuss these issues or to respond to these issues. And I started having conversations with young people, especially boys and the men, where I'm really drawn to. And so when we have those conversations, I realized that I thought I could do something that mentors did for me. And that number of boys started growing, having conversations around issues to do with gender equality, around economic issues and things like that. And I thought, well, this is not something that I can do by myself. I wanted to do it in a structured way, and also just to call for more support on board for me to just be able to respond to this issue. And that is how Men of Honor was born in 2020. And so really our focus was, or rather our aim is basically empower adolescent boys and young men to be responsible adult men in the community for themselves, first of all, and then extending to the larger community. And answering your the last part of the question about holding myself accountable, accountability in this issue. I think first of all for me is about continuous learning, and also just getting to understand what patriarchy is all about, and how it affects both the women and the men. Of course, we know predominantly is the women, but we see that even the men are affected with patriarchy because they have to conform to these standards that are set in society, and they have to deal with a lot of anger. They have to deal with a lot of mental health issues that they cannot freely bring about because they feel pressured. And at the end of the day, we see that translating into, men being abusive, being violent, and all that. So really, that's how I hold myself accountable. Aside from that, also is just introspection, self-assessment, checking myself from time to time. I'm a dad to two little girls in my home. I also have two girls that I'm staying with. So I'm surrounded by girls and women. So most of the times I take time to just introspect and think about the relationships that I have with the women, that I have with the girls around me, be it at my workplace, but also wherever I am. Sometimes I thought, this is a conversation that I was having with my partners, that I thought maybe I was being biased towards the boys and the young men. And so for me, that is a reflection of how it is important for me to just take time to introspect and think about how I relate with women and the girls within the home and beyond the confinement of the family. Thank you so much.
All right, thank you, Peter.
I'll go next. Hi, everyone. It's really good to be here as well. Appreciate the invitation by Global Rights for Women. I think this is an important conversation. I'm glad to be a part of it. For me, briefly, I would often say the entry point into this work came in a formal way as a family therapist about 30 plus years ago, the YWCA. YWCA, yeah, in Grand Rapids, Michigan. And I was part of a team of about 25 therapists working primarily with families impacted by incest. And so I work a lot with men in that capacity. One of my colleagues, there were about 3 men on the staff, and one of them died. He used to be the facilitator of the group for men who harmed, battered, abused women. And my supervisor said, hey, I want you to be the facilitator along with my colleague for this group. And I'm thinking, wow, I don't know anything about domestic violence. Why would I be part of that? But anyway, I end up co-facilitating, learning from my colleague. And there is when I really get, from a professional standpoint, to begin to appreciate and understand patriarchy and its impact on men's lives and my role and responsibility to do something about it. But I would say, in retrospect and with a lot of reflection, this was a spiritual calling, at least the way I define spirituality. I don't think it was any accident. Like Peter said, it's also very personal. I just didn't think of it that was the entry point, or I'm doing this work because of that. But it is clear to me now that because of my experience all around me, in the home, in the community, violence against women was very visible and very impactful. And I think of this as the universe's wisdom to bring me into a space, to bring that personal insight and experience along with quote unquote professional insight to really make a difference. As far as accountability, I was really fortunate to be part of an organization that had one of its core principles was we are the work. And no matter our engagements with men in the different ways that we did that, we had a responsibility always to look in the mirror. There's no arriving. We have to be constantly doing the work. And as Peter said, being introspective, reading, taking responsibility for our actions, and so on and so on. And I continue to do that even though I'm not part of that organization anymore. Through my readings, my interaction with women, challenging other men, it is necessary to continue to be engaged in that way.
So true. Thank you. Graham, do you have a short response to that before we get into the individual questions?
Yeah, I think the thing I think the most about is that there's no arriving. This is an ongoing process of learning. And just when I think I've got it figured out, something new comes up that shows I haven't. And I'm so appreciative of the energy of the people who help me and the other people around me through that process of understanding that this work involves discomfort. It involves learning things that I didn't think I needed to learn, and finding that, oh yes, I did. So that's the main thing I think about it.
Yeah, it's amazing. Yeah, I think the accountability thing is huge. I always remember when I first started doing this work in '83, it's like, okay, am I willing to give up the benefits of sexism? Because I had so many benefits as a guy. Am I willing to give those up? That was the biggest challenge for me. Am I willing to stop doing A, B, C, and D, whether it's just telling jokes, or am I willing to compete equally with women in the workplace? Because if I do, then I'm not getting the next advancement. Am I willing to be fair and be equal? So it was amazing. And then there's privileges I can't give up because I'm a guy and I'm identified as a guy. Can I use those privileges to undermine patriarchy and dismantle patriarchy? So accountability, I think, has been huge. Okay, Peter, I'm going to ask you a question. While we know that patriarchy is a universal construct globally, we also know that cultures around the world are focusing their work on particular issues. In Zambia, could you tell us more about what you are doing working with men and boys to promote women's equality and shifting gender norms around gender-based violence? And how do systemic factors contribute to the vulnerability of women? And what do you think is a successful approach for men seeking to challenge patriarchy? Quite the questions. I'm sorry, you might be on mute, Peter.
All right. Thank you so
Very
much.
good.
Yeah. So I'll take on those three questions from the order that you've asked me. First of all, I'd like to just talk about a few statistics for the country. I know, of course, in your opening, you talked about some global statistics and American statistics, but also just to share a few statistics as documented by the Zambia Police Victim Support Unit. So it shows that 20% of the women or the girls have suffered sexual abuse before turning the age of 18. And 39% of girls are married before age 18. So we have a lot of child marriages in the country. Adolescent girls continue to die from different complications arising from childbearing because they're not of age. We also see that 36% of Zambian women have experienced physical violence since the age of 15. So that is why we see the importance of our work, and that's something that we cannot do all by ourselves. So in order to tackle some of these issues that are really kind of emanating from, the patriarchy side of issues in the country, as an organization, one of the things we do is that we provide education programs where we conduct workshops, seminars, mentorship sessions with adolescent boys and young men. And maybe just to talk about why we focus on adolescents. as an organization is the fact that we see this is an opportunity for us, to kind of, shape behavior of the boys even before they transition into adulthood. We see that's the critical time when they're forming values, they're forming their beliefs and so on and so forth. So we take advantage of that. But also we engage, as an organization, we engage communities through the local leaders, traditional leaders. We work with traditional leaders. We work with the faith leaders as well. So we target the leaders or community members who are influential in the communities, to talk about these issues and also just to challenge the negative traits of masculinity. So we bring these demographics on board to talk about talk first of all to raise awareness about patriarchy, but also to deal with the negative effects of that issue as well. On the other hand, we also carry out positive role modeling. We do this by linking boys with men who are of right standing in the community that can, positively influence them to, to challenge these negative masculinity traits that we see in our communities or in our society. So those are some of the things that we do as an organization, and also, of course, working with different players in the community to deal with issues that arise from issues to do with mental health affecting boys and the men, so that they can freely open up and express themselves. The other program we have as an organization is called the Men's Boardroom. So this is basically a space where young men come together, and then they, given time or a space for them to speak about the challenges that they're going through, to express themselves, and also to just kind of provide information to them in relation to gender equality and the importance of it in our society. We also promote positive leadership in that sense, so that they are placed in a position where they are able to, be able to deal with these challenges. So the country has made strides. They're making an effort to deal with gender equality or gender inequality in the other sense. And so in that regard, we have different documents that have been developed. One of them is the National Strategy on Ending Child Marriages in Zambia. We also have the National Gender Policy. And in addition to that, we have the Marriage Act, and all these are under a ministry which was put by the government called the Ministry of Gender to deal with these issues. However, we still see that despite these efforts, the implementation side of things is not really up to par. And so we continue to see, women's rights still being violated. We continue to see child marriages, teenage pregnancies, and gender-based violence, and mostly men perpetrating the violence against the women. So that's the challenge that we continue to have despite that. Excuse me. So what we are doing also in that regard is really to just ensure that, and I'm moving on to the other point of the question in terms of successful approaches that we've seen as an organization in challenging patriarchy. Number one, speaking directly to the boys about issues and challenges or consequences of patriarchy. The other side of things is, when we are discussing, when we see this more often, is when people are discussing heroes, for example, in a country, mostly you find that it's the men at the center. Even when people are talking about our independence as a country, the freedom fighters, mostly it's the men that are spoken about. And so I think the approach should also be to echo those heroes, the women heroes that have also, taken part in the fight for freedom as an example. The other part of it is, and I mentioned this area, is positive role modeling, ensuring that we have more men, in our communities that are taking a stand, more men that are, standing out to be positive role models, and deliberately or intentionally taking up some boys in the communities to mentor them and talk to them about positive masculinity. Some of us were fortunate enough, as personally, when I was older, I had an opportunity. I think when I was about 15 or so, I had an opportunity to have positive role models, males, who helped me in shaping my life or the behavior or my beliefs about women and girls. And so that's something that we want to see being done more, where we are having these men intentionally taking up young boys and young men and talking to them about patriarchy and the effects that it has,
Yes.
not just on the women but also
Yes.
on themselves. And
Yeah.
so, lastly but not the least, I think the other important thing is to educate ourselves. We need to continue learning about, about gender, about women's rights and women's movements, and also just understanding what gender is all about. Because most of the times when this subject of gender comes up, especially in my side where I am, this part of the world, when we talk about gender, people think it's a women's issue. And so even the men don't want to engage themselves in this conversation. So when we talk about gender, we want the men also to understand that this is a subject that affects everyone. It's not just an issue for a certain section of, of members of society.
Yeah.
So the education part that we are talking about.
Thank you, Peter. I'm sorry to interrupt you a little bit here, but it's just time thing. But it is, I love the fact that you're talking about the boys and the men acting and working in partnership with women, because men's silence supports men's violence and the oppression. So we have to stand up and speak if we're going to be accountable, if we care about women's lives. Graham, I've got a question for you. We know that men in groups often use humor as a way to bond with each other, and that the common denominator is often jokes that demean women, reinforcing patriarchal gender norms socially and in the workplace. I know that in your practice working with men, you use humor in other ways. And how can we ensure that discussions with men challenging patriarchy are inclusive of all those impacted by this oppression and address the intersecting identities and experiences of survivors of men's violence?
Yeah. Well, it's a tough one, isn't it?
It's quite a question, yes.
I just think we have to engage with the men, and so there's a very fine balance between understanding what the men's experience is, and then encouraging men to look at their lived experience in comparison to other people. And I don't think many men think very critically about those things. So it leaves us trying to find ways to engage men. And this is what I was interested in today, is to think that we have to get the tone right of the discussion, so that as much as possible we're bringing people along and we're not colluding with them. And by colluding with them, I mean buying into inappropriate sense of humor and the like. And yet at the same time, a lot of the men we work with, they use humor as a way of managing difficult things. And I think that we have a double responsibility there to not only engage with the men in the way that they relate to things, but also being able to set the limits for what things can be treated lightly and what things are actually very deadly serious. And I think if we're only doing the deadly serious stuff, we're going to lose the engagement. And so we have to find the right tone to do this work. So, I mean, this is something that I think I constantly have to work with, is to think, how can I engage men so that they'll talk openly and freely and won't feel like I'm just judging them for being men? Because to me, that's not the point. The judging part is really needs to be put to one side, and we need to find ways to engage with men that treat the topic seriously, but also account for how they use humor as a way of avoiding stuff. So that's a fine balance, I think. And we do that in groups, but we also have to do that in our interagency work. Because to me, the work with men and stopping violence is as much about getting all the systems lined up and having an analysis of gender and race, so that as much as possible, when we're wanting systems to intervene because victims are relatively powerless at times, we have to have that intervention in such a way that it's accountable to the lived reality of women and also the men. So we have to kind of think, how do we engage, and also think, how do we set the guide rails for that discussion? That's what I was thinking about. Does any of that make sense, Chuck?
Well, you know, the intervention piece and the accountability, holding men accountable and intervening effectively, systemically, right? So systems change. It's not just about education for men, it's also about systems change, changing
Yeah.
policies and practices, because
Yes.
they are creating the social norms that support men's violence against women. So I like your stuff. And I like, okay, how do we talk to men? How do we challenge them about patriarchy? When do we challenge them about their jokes? When do we challenge them about what they're saying about women as they walk down the street? Right? Because again, our
Yes.
silence just supports it. We have to speak out. So I appreciate it, Graham. Yeah.
Thanks.
And if you can use humor as a way to challenge patriarchy, right on.
Yeah.
You know? Yeah, good sense. Because like you say, it captures them, it can capture some men in a way that other comments don't.
It's a slippery slope.
Yeah, very slippery.
But it's really worth experimenting with that. And I think a lot depends on us having a measure of trust and understanding with the people we work with. We can't just see them as brutes, because even though they've behaved as brutes to their partner and to their family, their extended family, we still have a responsibility in that they more than likely will be going back into that situation. We just get them for a little while to raise things that are very uncomfortable for them. And so we have to gauge what's the tone we use for that discussion that doesn't trivialize it, but also recognizes their experience. And for me, I took a long time to understand that my experience in the world is so shaped by being male, by being white. And it's not that I'm ashamed of being male or white. That's not what it's about. It's about seeing what the responsibility is that comes with that and how to work across lines of privilege and lived experience.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, yeah, totally agree.
So I'm still learning that, Chuck.
It's an ongoing process.
Yeah.
With all this, you know, in the US, white male privilege, it's all kinds of, yeah. How do I challenge, what do I do about that privilege? Am I aware of it? Do I care about, like Peter, you were talking about, and how conscious am I? You, Lester, go to you. Next question. So clearly, and this falls right into line, clearly dismantling patriarchy requires challenging and transforming social, political, and economic policies and practices at every level of society that reinforce male dominance. And you've been working with men, the beneficiaries of these patriarchal norms and practices, in a variety of settings for 30 plus years. So talk about your experience of an approach that is promising or effective in moving men to abandon patriarchal ideology and behaviors.
About that. So I want to start with emphasizing a point that is connected, that you just referenced in that question, to really hold again that this is structural. This is a structural problem. And I want to acknowledge that women's leadership for so many years, and this continues, of course, women are leading the way in challenging these institutions, government, courts, and so on, to really ensure as much as possible that there's transformation happening at that level. We know the resistance that we are facing, that has been faced in their attempts to really make a difference on this institutional level. I want to start there because part of the American experience, which is highly individualistic, there is a push, and I think is quite intentional, to continue to want to see these social issues as a problem of individual. This is not a problem of individual men. Yes, men are the beneficiaries of a patriarchal system, but let's not keep our eyes off of the structural aspect of this. But hey, we're focusing here on some of our experience in engaging men, and that's important because we know that an individual man in a position of power, let's say on the Supreme Court or the government agency or corporation, whatever, can really make a difference in advancing the interest of women and move closer as much as possible towards gender justice. So I just want to start there. We know, and I want to reference Bell Hooks's, many of you know of her, or the late Bell Hooks, author, activist, scholar. I want to lift up her definition. I'm going to paraphrase it because I don't have it all in my head. She said, patriarchy is a socio-political economic institution that insists that men are a system that insists that men are inherently superior to women and girls and others deemed weak, and are endowed with the resources and the power to enforce that dominance. I wanted to start there because the foundation of patriarchy is inherently a violent. In order for it to be sustained, it requires violence and the threat of violence. And often what is ignored, we know the impact on women and girls, but I want in this brief contribution here to focus on the reality also that boys are harmed by patriarchy. I want to start say boys because boys become men. That socialization of boys into this world is a violent one, emotionally, physically, sexually, and otherwise. We talked about statistics. We know, and it's very difficult to document, I understand. So the latest I saw is probably, for example, 1 in 4 to 6 boys. I actually think it's more closer to 1 in 3 boys. As a family therapist who worked in the area of incest and sexual violence, I work with those boys. Are survivors of sexual abuse at the hands of men, enacting that patriarchal directive by the right to dominate and control. This is about ownership of women, ownership of children. And because, again, part of patriarchy, ironically, asserts that or aggresses that there's no real room for boys and men's pain. You are a boy, you're a man, suck it up, move on. But these boys who become men are carrying the wounds of patriarchy and are enacting them usually on women, on children, and on men too. One of the adaptations of this patriarchal trauma in the lives of boys, the adaptation is, hey, and it's mostly internal, influenced by the external. It's internal, let me repeat, influenced by the external, that adaptation is usually a patriarchal one, because the boy learns also, okay, what is acceptable? How do I continue to be part of this experience so I'm not ostracized any further? And the psychological adaptation of what we see, violence, anger, rage, entitlement, narcissism, all in the package of, hey, you're a male identified person. Hey, here we go. We have indoctrinated you. You are a loyal soldier to stand at the gates of patriarchy and do your part. Basically, that indoctrination is a disconnect, men, boys, disconnecting from self, disconnecting from others, disconnecting from the environment. So that's what we see. It's difficult to hold on to that. And many of us, some of us on this call, when we watch the impact of patriarchy in the lives of women and girls, it is sometimes very difficult to hold that boys and men are wounded too by patriarchy. But if we're going to go to talk about transforming boys and men into rejecting patriarchal ideology and behavior, I believe that's the place we have to go. I am seeing it in my own work of 30 plus years. And as I continue to see it individually as a therapist as well, where I get to see the wounds of patriarchy. They often show up, in anxiety, depression, loneliness, but generally men aren't encouraged to show those things externally. What they do instead is show aggression and rage as a mask for the pain that is under there. In a patriarchal society is too bad, suck it up again, you're a man, there's no place for you. We have to open up the hood and look under the patriarchal hood and attend to what is under there. If we don't do that, we're going to continue to move in a direction that is not in the interest of women and girls, which is, I think it's called the manosphere. Men are moving online, being solicited and encouraged to go as far to the right as possible, being groomed for violence. It's a place they're saying, all right, I get a place to be reminded that I'm okay, that I'm a man, that I have power, because I feel so wounded and so powerless. And that right says, I've got a place for you. If we want to move in the direction to create the kind of justice for women and girls, we have to attend to this. Last point, most men don't even think about the word patriarchy. It doesn't mean anything to most men. As a matter of fact, a wall goes up when men hear that. Also, toxic masculinity. I want to really strongly encourage us to find a different way to talk about that. I really think the language of toxic masculinity is a problematic one. I understand it. It signals problematic behavior that is deadly to women and girls. But men are going like this, and it doesn't really mean much, and it reinforces the idea that it's an individual problem, and these men are inherently problematic. So that's my take. Let's get under the hood, address it. I get to see it, I get to work with it, and see men move in a different direction, because finally there's a space or spaces to work to make a difference in their lives, and the women and children and boys and men around them. So those are my initial thoughts in terms of a practice that I think has promise.
Yeah, thank you, Lester. Yeah, it's very important. It's really interesting to me about how do we do both? How do we deal with the boys' wounds and men's wounds? And at the same time, then deal with the privilege as well. And like you say, it's structural, it's personal. We have personal privilege. So how do we deal with the wound, speak to men of their wounds and also their privilege? And then, a lot of the awareness stuff, people think it's a lot about education. And the only reason I do any kind of education and awareness building with men is to create the social capital and the political will to change organizational practices and public policy. Like you're saying, this is structural. And that supports all the things you're saying about supporting boys. Okay, I'm not supposed to be vulnerable, express these feelings, and I'm supposed to have power. So it's quite a process. And it's been amazing to work with women in that process. And Patricia, I'm going to send it over to you now to look at what kind of questions we're getting from the audience. And so thanks a lot, you three, for all your comments. They're great as well. Just want to make sure that's clear. That's for sure.
Yeah, thank you.
Obvious.
This conversation's been incredible, and we have a very robust chat going on, as well as really, really great questions. And in the interest of time, I know that we can't get to all of them, of course, but some of them do point to a lot of the same things. So I'll read one question that I think is representative of a number of them, which is, do you have recommendations for ways to approach young men about the issue? And some of the other questions are just generally men too. Sometimes I feel getting much into feminist rhetoric is automatically a non-starter, that I get dismissed for intervening and saying something during that locker room talk. And I don't know how to approach it by promoting more bystander intervention. And someone else in one of their questions was, what are some of these approaches in terms of working with men? So who would like to take that one on?
My sense is Peter addressed a lot of that already, but it sounded like Peter, you wanted to say something about that.
You can just go ahead. I'll throw in a bit, maybe in half a minute. Want me to go?
Yeah.
Sure.
Right. Oh, yeah, sure. I've seen the question really. It's around the approach in terms of engaging men or young men in that question. First of all, I think from my observation, with my experience working with the young men and the men themselves, I think number one, approaching the men as a woman or females, approaching a group of men to discuss about issues pertaining to gender equality or patriarchy issues, I think really doesn't work out. First of all, I think from my observation, the men or these boys, they want to see someone that can relate with them. They want to feel they're talking to someone, or someone is talking to them who is someone who understands their issues, someone who can relate to what they are going through and things like that. So first of all, like for us, when we're having those deep conversations with the men, it's just men in the room or men in the space. So that also gives you a leeway or a way that an opportunity, because now they can, be in a space where they can freely express themselves and talk about these issues and also just listen. Sometimes I think the other challenge that comes in is that when a woman comes in the space of men, first of all, and because of a lot of cultural issues that most men grow up with, objectifying women and so on and so forth. When you come in their presence, first of all, they're already judging you, looking at the way you are dressed, looking at the way you are talking and all those things. So they may not get that message that you're taking to them. So I think that's the approach that I would like to share.
Thank you, Peter. Anybody else have any comments about that question?
Yeah.
Okay.
I think what's important is to talk with men and boys in ways that uses and values to some extent their language, so that we're not coming across as just movement people. Because when I say movement people, I think there's a whole way of talking in the field that we work in, and I think some people can engage with that, but a lot of the men, they're not going to engage with that. We've got to find the language that's not abusive, that's engaging, that still gives us the opportunity to challenge, but challenge with care and challenge with love. Because I think if we just batter people with movement words, they're not going to listen. And I think the value of what we have in our movement, if we can call it a movement, the movement to end violence against women, which connects with all the other movements, we have to use language that people can relate to. And so I think that means also using a sense of humor carefully and just not being all dry all the time. I think that's part of what we have to do. And I think the most successful people at doing this work tend to engage people with a bit of humor in an appropriate way, because I think that makes it easier for men to engage. There's plenty of opportunities to get into the difficult stuff, but before you do that, you have, well, I've found I have to meet the men where they're at. And that's a careful balance. And it's very useful to be doing that with women co-facilitators, because they can spot things sooner and better than I can in all sorts of situations. And it's very valuable to have that, and for me to demonstrate valuing that.
Well, thank you, Graham and Peter,
No.
for those great.
Patricia, can I just toss in one real quick thing?
Mhm.
One, talking about getting pushback. One thing I learned early in doing this work in the early 80s was that I was getting so much pushback, and I read an article from a gentleman, pro-feminist gentleman, said, if you're not getting pushback, then you're not doing anything significant. Because when you challenge power, you're going to get pushback. If you're not getting that pushback, then it's not a real challenge. The other thing I'd just say about talking to men, one of the things I've found most powerful is telling men about the statistics of men's violence against women, because many men don't know half the women in the US are being raped. And then mentioned this couldn't happen without cultural support. And that's why I'm challenging about the sexist joke. And then big question is, do we care about women's lives? So that's just saying that was really useful, is letting men know about the stats of the violence, because a lot of men don't know what women are living with every day.
Right. Well, it's a great segue, and we only have a few moments, but this question, given the times that we're living in now, have the panelists noticed a change in other men during this backlash time? Are they speaking more openly about their anger towards women? Are there any other examples, positive or negative? I think we have time for one person to answer this. Perhaps you, Lester.
I'll go. Yeah, I'd like to answer. Again, of course, don't have anything empirical at this point, but there's enough anecdotal and other evidence to suggest that indeed, yes, there is pushback in a very significant way. And I think one of the ways to measure that is the appeal still of a lot of people who are in positions of power, particularly talking without having to name, because I don't want to give any energy to it. If you think about a particular presidential candidate, former president, it still is amazing to me that in 2024, with all that we know, that he continues to have and draw such a significant number of people's interest, and particularly men. As I was saying earlier, men are feeling even more so, from my observation and the spaces I'm in, harmed and victimized by the Me Too movement, women, and they're looking for a home. And he and other folks on the right are saying, we got a home for you. You've been emasculated. You've been harmed. We need to help you restore your sense of manhood and your rightful place in the home. Yeah, it's a draw. And so he becomes very attractive because he so often represents so much of what they are about. So yeah, that's my quick observation. Second, if we have time, I'll say more, but yeah. So we got to do something. We got to make it much more attractive to really undo, and invite men into seeing there's a different way. And it's a better way. It is a safer way. It's a just way for you and family. Because one of the things we've discussed many times in this space and beyond is, unfortunately, for those in privilege, we have to go after their self-interest. This is how it is in your self-interest to think and act differently, to challenge the ideology of patriarchy and the behaviors, and move towards a more just way of engaging the world.
Okay, thank you so much, and I'll turn it over to Chuck for our concluding comments.
Okay, thank you, Patricia. And thank you for all the questions, everyone. And I want to thank our guests, of course, for talking with us today and sharing what you experienced, and thank all the participants who are on this call, this Zoom event. So thank you for all your insights and the work you have been doing, panelists, for the years of support gender justice, right? For years and years, decades. So it's great that you made and stayed with that commitment. I like also thank our colleagues, Patricia, Hambi, and Sophia Kulo, for ensuring this conversation went smoothly on the technological side, which is important. And just let you know, we've included links in the chat to learn more. And if you would like to support Global Rights for Women, your contribution goes to supporting the work of advocates around the globe, centering survivor voices as a means to achieving systemic change, listening to survivors to make that change. You'll also receive an email in the next few days with resources, as well as a link to the recording. And so I want to thank you to those caring enough to listen and then make the changes necessary in your personal lives, at work, in your communities, state, province, and country, to ensure that women and men have equal access to safety, economic security, government authority, religious opportunity, and a life of joy and wonder. So once again, thank you so much for being here. It was an honor to share this space with you all, and really appreciate Global Rights for Women's work and all the women throughout the world and the men who are working to end this patriarchal societies and bring us to equality and freedom and love. Thank you.